Please forgive my poor Latin pronunciation. But desiderata is Latin for desired things. Maybe more accurately, it means desirable thoughts. Max Ehrmann wrote it in the 1920s. He never copyrighted it. After his death, his wife did copyright it in a collection of her late husband's poetry. Unfortunately, however, the rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Baltimore published it in a collection of his favorite spiritual quotes, and on the cover of that book he put the presumed date of the founding of the church, 1692. So when I was young, people like my older sister had a copy of it on a psychedelic poster which bore the absurd 1692 date. Its real history of familiarity came when an army psychiatrist had copies of it given to soldiers during World War II to help them to stay centered and to fight off depression and despair. I hadn't thought about it for years until one of our listeners, my friend Susan Mendola in Lufkin, Texas, posted it on Facebook, and I hesitated long enough to read over it again and found it to be much more valuable than those psychedelic posters might have indicated. Right there on Facebook, the home of Russian propaganda, insane conspiracy theory advocates, racists, neo-Nazis, and extremist political memes from both the left and the right, stood this sage advice: as far as it is possible without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. Speak your truth quietly and clearly, and listen to others. Even the dull and the ignorant, they too have their story. Avoid loud and aggressive persons, for they are a vexation to the spirit. Wow! It just hit me as it was possible to discuss important topics online while speaking your truth quietly and clearly. And also listening to others, because even the dull and the ignorant also have a point of view, and it may be entirely valid. Ehrmann was not a 17th century sage, and frankly, he wasn't even a well-known poet. This is his most famous work, and it was only used by him. He had it printed in a Christmas card in the early 20th century. But generations before there were computers or an internet or social media, we see this little piece speaking a relevant word to our generation beyond anything that the author might have imagined. Ours is a nation that fought a bloody civil war, so I have to keep reminding myself that we're not really more divided than we've ever been. I wrote that in the prayer of confession today, but there have been worse times, just not in our memory. Things are bad. Many of the most important decisions in our nation's history have been made only when the left and the right, Republicans and Democrats, found a way to work together. In 1964, in the midst of sometimes violent and certainly controversial racial strife during the Civil Rights Movement, Lyndon Johnson managed to get a bipartisan vote to pass the Civil Rights Act. In 1973, we passed the Endangered Species Act. When Richard Nixon was in office, Republicans and Democrats came together to save endangered animals. In 1983, we saved Social Security through a bipartisan agreement about how to make sure that the funding didn't run out. 1990, we got the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. And in 2002, Senators McCain and Feingold passed a legitimate attempt at trying to control and rein in the political influence of campaign contributions. 2006, there was a bipartisan move to protect voters' rights. 2015, under the Obama administration, they managed to save some part of the No Child Left Behind and make it actually try to make sure that no child was left behind. And in 2016, passed the Global Food Security Act. Republicans and Democrats have a history, albeit spotty, of working together when it really mattered, of being able to set aside their differences long enough to accomplish an important task. Compare that to what we've been through in the last month with the government shut down, and we almost didn't get to have a State of the Union address. Republicans and Democrats have been squared off in such a ferocious debate about this ridiculous wall on our southern border. Now, mind you, I'm not going to watch it Tuesday night. I just think it ought to happen. It's in the Constitution. You know, it ought to take place. I think it's a horrible sign of the division of the political parties that we nearly had to say, would you mind just phoning in your lies? But, you know, he is the president, and he should be allowed to lie in public, I guess. I've commented before on the nature of social media online allowing us to fall into heated partisan debates in which we eviscerate one another in a matter of seconds because we can. And though the parody of the Bohemian Rhapsody that we're going to enjoy in a few minutes says that no one ever changed their mind because of a Facebook mudslinging session, you know, to be perfectly honest, not very many of us had the opportunity to grow up with progressive parents that took us to a liberal, open-minded church. Most of us had to grow out of our native indigenous conservatism and our religious literalism and tracing the steps. How did we get from being closed-minded, conservative, religious literalists to where we are today? And remembering the steps to that path is not always easy. Maturity is part of it. Education is part of it. Also, I think there's a certain amount of allowing ourselves to become disillusioned, to become cynical about old beliefs, maybe even embarrassed by them. And sometimes maybe being humiliated in a heated debate was part of our finding the courage and the ability to change, to come to view the world differently. With the release of the White House tapes in the early 1970s, I learned that the President of the United States was even more foul-mouthed than me and all of my adolescent malcontent friends. In the Pentagon Papers, I learned that my government would lie to me about a war in which they were perfectly willing to trade my life for corporate profit. In college, I learned that, in fact, my father did not know everything. In seminary, I learned that the church had been maintaining a charade of lies for centuries. And in years of church board meetings, I learned that pompous, self-righteous elders would lie like a cheap rug to make themselves feel important. It's not difficult to come to see the world as a grand contest of them versus us, a battle between the righteous and well-informed and the ignorant and ignoble. St. Paul first used the phrase in one of his letters to the church in Corinth about suffering fools gladly. And even Paul didn't use the term in a complimentary way. Most of us have found in recent years an emphasis on the word suffer. We suffer fools, like having to listen to what our relatives want to tell us that they have learned from hours of watching Fox News. But G.K. Chesterton encouraged his peers to focus on the gladly part of the phrase, that somehow we suffer fools gladly. We should listen even to people who dramatically disagree with us and who may have opinions that are entirely uninformed. It is exhausting. And yet I think it is a gift of grace that we show to people. I will readily confess that I have been sucked into bloody battles of words in online discussion boards and in social media. And every time when I think that I have outgrown that kind of childish exchange, someone will find a new hot button that even I wasn't aware that I still had. And then we'd all get to publicly discover just how long my fuse isn't. In real life, I have almost no contact with people who do not essentially agree with me in matters of politics, religion, ethics, morality, and even economics. Even online, I've insulated myself from almost all disagreement. I don't like to fight. I don't like unpleasant exchanges. But we really have to question ourselves about how entirely we can afford to be completely disengaged from our surroundings. We live in a congressional district that has elected the most unqualified, dishonest, and ignorant congressman in America. We didn't elect him once, or twice, or 3 times, 5 times. Our neighbors have reelected Billy Long. I do not personally know anyone in Springfield who voted for Donald Trump. I cannot name the name of a single person in this area. And yet, 7 out of 10 of our neighbors voted for Donald Trump. 7 out of 10, the overwhelming majority, one of the largest majorities of any congressional districts in America. So unless we want to just be completely ideologically forced into a plenum, we have to find some place between surrender and slander, a place that we might call sanity. As Ehrman wrote nearly a century ago, as far as possible without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. Because there's no reason why we cannot manage to, as he said, speak your truth, but speak it quietly and clearly. And then in turn listen to others, even the dull and the ignorant, for they have their story too. There have been some social experiments between conservatives and liberals where in a debate forum, the liberal is required to articulate the conservative's position, and the conservative is required to articulate the liberal position. Because if you cannot articulate fairly what those who disagree with you believe, then you haven't listened to them. You don't understand them. We ought to be able to do what a high school debate team does and go and pull out a slip of paper out of the hat to find out which side of the issue you have to argue. We need to understand both sides. Now, I'll tell you, I'm tired of racists, and it doesn't take very much to punch that button for me where I really want to let somebody have it. But I'm also very tired of having to watch the rich exploit the poor. I'm tired of having to find a way to be satisfied with a government that's run by corporations for their own profit instead of a democracy that seeks the common good. But even though the stakes are high, there is very little that is ever accomplished through vitriol and hatred. I should know. I've tried. I'm going to share this with you, not that you should repeat it, but I write my sermons and articles with a little bobblehead of Lewis Black right by my keyboard. And it's got a button on it so that he says things that I don't say. He curses for me. I have never claimed in any format to be able to suffer fools gladly. But I know very well that Lewis's angry rants don't help either. I don't agree with Ehrman's sort of unity-inspired assertion that the universe is unfolding as it should. I don't believe that. I don't believe there's a divine plan and that everything that happens is happening according to God's will. I think the universe is capricious, and that most good things only happen if somebody gets organized and makes it happen. I suspect that the soldiers that all got a copy of this during World War II would not think that the world was working out according to plan. But I do agree that both my peeps, my progressive democratic socialist peers who have lots of sheepskin under glass and enormously informed opinions, as well as the Fox News consumer who's sitting across from me in the auto mechanics waiting room with a smug and condescending look on his face, that we are all children of the universe. Everything in the world is made of 12 particles of matter held together by 4 forces of nature. That's true of trees and rivers and stars and the air, because we all have a right to be here. They have as much of a right as I do. Now, I'm not going to abandon my values, and I'm not going to surrender simply to be accommodating or to find peace in my personal life. Still, in spite of how different I am from most of my surroundings, I make the conscious decision not to be a jerk. And when I realize that I am being a jerk, I choose to correct course and to come back into being prophetic in a very sane and civil manner. I still believe that the whole world does have a right to my opinion. I just want to present it in a package that seems credible and persuasive and not mean and vindictive. With all its sham and drudgery, with all its broken dreams, this is still a beautiful world. And we have every reason, even with Trump in the White House, even with Billy Long representing our district, even with Mitch McConnell as the majority leader in the Senate, to be cheerful and to strive to be happy.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.